Okay, good morning and happy Friday. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Oregon Transportation Commission meeting. And this morning we have Councilmember Rosenthal who would like to welcome us to your beautiful city of Ashland. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tammy. I'm Rich Rosenthal. I'm on the Ashland City Council, and on behalf of Mayor Stromberg and the Medford City Council, we are so pleased that you're having your meeting here in our town, and I know that you had other options in this area to go to, and we're very appreciative to have you here. And I'm in my 7th year on the City Council here, and I'm also on the Rogue Valley MPO with Commissioner Brown. And it's taken many years to figure out all the acronyms that you have to deal with, and really appreciative as an Ashland resident for the grant funding that you have authorized to the city of Ashland over the years, most recently a TGM grant that is going to help transform our already beautiful downtown area, but we've been working for many years on ways of augmenting our downtown transportation flow and study, and that really is a shot in the arm for our efforts to do it, which has been difficult. So thank you for that. I also want to acknowledge that there are City of Ashland staff members, our city attorney, David Lohman, who served as a commissioner for multiple terms, and our public works director, the Admiral, Paula Brown, who's been on your, and we're very proud to have that strong connection. And thank you for what you do, and thank you for being here. And on behalf of the mayor, who was unable to make it, we're appreciative.
We had a lovely time engaging with the mayor yesterday, and yes, we had an opportunity to visit with Mr. Lohman last night. And we like to get out into communities to understand what the needs are and actually see the projects and see where the investments and the improvements that the investments are making. And so that doesn't happen by chance. So thank you for your engagement on the MPO and the work that you're doing as a council member as well. One of the beauties of being on the commission is hearing from the communities of the needs and priorities and how all of that factors into the state and the state's economy too. So your work is important to us. You may not see us as often as you would like, but we do try to get around the state so that we can get a feel for what's going on within community.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for all the small communities like ours that you visit from time to time. And it's a big deal, and it's acknowledged and appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, so with that, Director Mather, I'll turn it over to you. We have a workshop on the Cascadia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, member of the Commission. Paul Mather, Deputy Director. Mac and I are going to continue our series on our workshops around the seismic preparedness of ODOT. I'm going to step out of my current role that I'm in and kind of step back into some of the previous roles I've played in developing some of the policies and documents that we have around seismic and go over the infrastructure side of this. Mac is going to follow me and then cover more of the organizational side, the preparedness of the organization to operate and continue to operate once Cascadia has happened. So if Jackie can pull my slides up, I'll get started. The one last thing I'll conclude with, which I think is kind of a way to cap this series of workshops off, we'll have a brief discussion about the role of the commission during all this. So you'll have heard a lot of information around Cascadia, and we'll get more specific around the specific role the commission has in this event. So part 3 of the Cascadia Earthquake Seismic Response. Just do a quick recap. So Jackie, would you mind going up there and just switching that so we can see the whole thing? I'm worried that we get further in my slides, we're going to miss some parts. But I'll just keep going. So Dr. Chris Goldfinger started us off, if you remember, several months ago, just talking to us about the science behind the earthquake and how it was discovered and some projections going forward of what to expect around that, which I found interesting. Just from a science nerd standpoint, I learned a lot, and I thought that was kind of good background for us. Followed by Scott Ashford, Dr. Scott Ashford, who has done a lot of work in this area, has traveled around the world, visited the different major earthquakes, subduction zone earthquake sites in Japan and Chile, and compared that to what that would be like for us. And specifically, he used this chart to illustrate the difference between the 2010 Chile earthquake and what we could expect here. A lot of similarities, but then not so much, in that the one in Chile happens quite frequently, and thus their building standards and infrastructure has been exposed to these major earthquakes, and so the damage you see in the 2010 Chile earthquake would be far less than maybe we would experience, since virtually none of our infrastructure has been exposed to this level of earthquake, since we're projected to happen once every, say, 300 to 400 to 500 years time frame. He also introduced us to the resilience plan and the work that he did leading that effort, gave us some context around how transportation fits in with other priorities, from power to police to healthcare to water, and some of the other issues that we'll have when this event happens. A couple months later, we came back in part two. Mike Harriman, the governor's resiliency officer, talked to us about the work underway by Homeland Security, how they're looking at transportation more broadly than just highways, and their assessment, and how that will be very valuable for us going ahead in our planning efforts. Andrew Phelps, the Director of Emergency Management, introduced us to the Cascade Playbook, and just how that plays in kind of a response mode, in what his agency and what all the state government transitions to once this event happens. So good background for us from both the scientific standpoint as well as the broader state standpoint. Gave us really some context as to, now as we turn today, as I talk about transportation and specifically highways, how does that fit into that context that we've heard over the last couple of sessions. The resiliency plan really is that plan we anchor back to that Dr. Scott Ashford talked about. Transportation doesn't obviously work in isolation. We need to work and prioritize our funding and our needs into that overall statewide response. As we heard, Redmond Airport is a key response point. So as we build our response, we need to build the transportation, the highway infrastructure, and particularly off of that network or that response plan that's in the Oregon Resiliency Plan. So in 2012, turning back, we came with the Seismic Plus program. This was our effort from a planning standpoint, as well as demonstrating a need standpoint, to kind of raise the flag of the importance of this issue and how we need funding for a seismic program. Up until the House Bill 2017, we did not have a seismic program. We did not have an ongoing funding stream. We did a few things ad hocly or as we had opportunity, but there was not a funding program for seismic. We called this Seismic Plus because it wasn't just the seismic issues with the bridges and the landslides. It also took into account the conditions of the bridges. And I'll talk more about this later, but it's a very key point. As our bridges become more deteriorated or less healthy, the amount of investment that it takes to just get the condition of the bridge up so it can accept some work done to retrofit them from a seismic standpoint, that becomes more costly, and they need to work in a dovetailed way, and thus we came with the Seismic Plus approach. I like this graphic that I've got up on the screen because it really kind of illustrates the magnitude of the earthquake. Again, we heard from Dr. Goldfinger as well as Dr. Scott Ashford, just the ground shaking motion that's represented by the color scheme on there, how much that's going to be felt on the coast. And it corresponds to the expense and the amount of work we have to do from a bridge and a landslide standpoint to do mitigation. And so like when we build bridges, we like to go to solid ground and kind of build from there our infrastructure. Our solid ground is back on 97 or the Redmond Airport, and build on that solid ground and move into the more damaged or more vulnerable areas with this earthquake. And our strategy that we came up with in the Seismic Plus is a 5-phase strategy that does that. It's a little hard to pick the colors out on that graphic, but Highway 97, Highway 58, 84, and then I-5 through the valley that you see there, that blue is our phase one to provide us that kind of first phase of a north-south, east-west connection that at least gets us into the Willamette Valley. Each of the 5 phases that we have laid out here were about $1 billion apiece in 2012 dollars. As our bridge conditions have deteriorated even more since then, as well as we've learned more about the costs of sizing retrofit, those numbers are far north of that $5 billion. The phase 2 of our plan builds upon that first phase, connects the balance of I-5 to the south, as well as major connections to population centers on the coast. 3 and 4 kind of fill that in. Phase 5 is really a collection at the end of the major bridges we have around the state. There's about a dozen or 2 major bridges. Locally, the Medford Viaduct would be one of those. On the coast, the McCullough Bridge, Astoria Bridge, the I-5 crossing of the Columbia. Those are bridges that are so huge from a cost standpoint and a replacement standpoint. We put them at kind of the end of our list and put them in a phase 5 and really need a separate funding strategy almost individually for each of those very large bridges. So that's a need that's on here. Our aim was to get as much of the network as possible and not kind of get stuck on any one spot with these large bridges. So we saved those towards the end in a phase 5. So what I just described was work that we did, again, at a planning level and a demonstration of need level back in 2012. And we used this to start communicating with legislators, other stakeholders. We took this information out to area commissions on transportation and did quite an education kind of outreach on our overall 30,000-foot kind of approach to at a planning level of and a need level for seismic. We heard 2 consistent themes back from that. One was in Southern Oregon, and here is, why are we in phase 2? Why don't we complete I-5? The vulnerability from an earthquake standpoint that we heard from Dr. Goldfinger is even more on the southern end of the Cascadia area, and so the likelihood of an earthquake affecting Southern Oregon is about twice as high as maybe on the north part. So we heard a lot about why so late on for Southern Oregon. We also heard on the coast, obviously, why are we kind of last in the game? What about us? We're going to be the ones that are going to be affected the most. How can we do something to mitigate and prepare ourselves here on the coast? Through a lot of efforts now, we've gone back and done some work, and we've just talked about this, and from a seismic triage standpoint, it really was kind of an approach and an idea that really started here in Southern Oregon. The work with the Area Commission on Transportation and other groups here locally started to kind of grapple with this. As I talked about, each stage is $1 billion, and so as you try to wrap your head around how do we fund $1 billion per stage, and yes, it'd be nice to do all 5 stages, and there's a lot of needs, and everyone's going to want their kind of piece of highway or their connection to the outside world connected first. But from a cost and a realistic standpoint, we need to do some prioritization of this. So they wrestled with that question and really came up with a triage approach. And the triage approach is one where you don't look at a section of highway and say, so for example, on I-5, how do we fix every bridge? How do we fix every landslide to connect us back to solid ground? What if we looked at the county network, the city network? What if we did a very minimalistic approach to this? And while you may not have the best route to connect to Southern Oregon, you still have a route to connect to Southern Oregon. And so they came up with a triage approach for the road, centered on the Rogue Valley, that provided connection on 140 over to that 97, that phase 1 piece there, as well as I-5 North and I-5 South. That work actually went on and was funded in the House Bill 2017, so that's one of the named projects in the bill that got funded to complete that work, and that work is in the design phase currently to get that work done. So that was a key learning piece that we had from a triage piece, and I'll come back and talk about more of that about that in a minute. And then on the coast, so what do we do on the coast? The coast is obviously going to be very severely impacted, not just from the shaking from the earthquake, but by the following tsunami that we heard about and saw about from Dr. Goldfinger and Dr. Ashford in the impact that they saw in Japan and Chile, and we're going to have similar experiences here. How do you prepare the coast, again, with the dollar amounts that we're talking about? We can do, all of 97, all of 58 for say a 5 or 10 mile section of 101. And so when you do a kind of a cost-benefit ratio of that, a connection, I can maybe get from Reedsport to Florence, or I can get, half of phase 1 done. Where's the kind of the logic from a triage standpoint or from a strategy standpoint in that? So what we came up with was, what if we, following kind of a model that we see elsewhere in the country from FEMA and preparing for major hurricanes, what you often see them doing is pre-staging relief water, relief materials, relief equipment on the fringes of where that hurricane is going to hit, and then they're prepared on their toes to respond immediately. We kind of took that thought process and said, well, what about our maintenance stations? What if we made them larger and pre-staged materials for road building, whether it's culverts, whether it's old rail cars, whether it's additional fuel, additional water, and kind of supersized our maintenance stations in a way that they could be pre-positioned material sources for contractors, for our crews to be kind of behind enemy lines and be in that damaged area and already pre-positioned to help a response area. And we identified kind of as a starting point 3 maintenance sites, Astoria, Newport, and Coos Bay as a place to start. Ultimately, we'd like to get to every maintenance station on the coast and have that kind of strategy. 2 of those 3 were funded in the last legislative session. Newport and Coos Bay were at least partially funded. They weren't completely funded, but partially funded. So we were able to move our maintenance stations that are currently in the inundation zone of the tsunami, pull them out of that, pull them to a site that's much larger and much more prepared to help assist the communities in those areas to be responsed. So those are 2 of the things that we, kind of wrinkles that we added to our Seismic Plus program. Back to the triage approach, the learning that we had in I-5, so we looked at that and said, so that's a good approach. We can now, for a lot less money, we can connect a lot more pieces of our system. Why don't we take that original 5-stage kind of backbone and go out to every county and work with their emergency management, work with their public works cities, and build that not just for I-5 in Southern Oregon, but for every one of those key lifelines that we identified in our overall strategy. So we started with Lane County and Tillamook County and said, so let's pilot this with you and see how this works. We want a kind of a more larger, more complex county, and one maybe it's a little more simpler, and one with more coastal issues. And there were different approaches, as you would expect, maybe a simpler, more practical approach that you would see in Tillamook County. And here's an example of what we put together. The map there on the right you may be able to see best. So 101 is in the orange, and several bridges on there in the red that's highlighted were multi-million-dollar pieces that we had in our overall strategy. And they said, well, that little highlighted county road there on the right, why don't we just do that and bypass those 4 bridges or 5 bridges that you were going to fund? And if we just fix this 1 or 2 little spots that we have on this road, we could bypass that. And again, it's not the most ideal route, but you have a route that connects Tillamook now to kind of the outside world after this happens. The map there in the center of the slide denotes kind of that same highlight there on the right of other areas. They went further and said, so on our system, on the county system, where are the most vulnerable bridges that we have, and what are our strategies that we could use to make sure we've got a prioritization similar to ODOT has from a state system, and prioritize those. So they found it very successful. Lane County had a similar effort. We are now, there's a map of all of Western Oregon. We are now have embarked on all the counties in Western Oregon and in Central Oregon, and repeating this exercise. We're about halfway through that and getting that data. So I would anticipate in about a year from now, we'll have all that data from all the counties and be able to go back to that original Seismic Plus and apply kind of a triage approach to that, and come back to you with some proposals on how we would kind of triage that system at a much less cost, and in a way that's much more, I think, effective in working with our local partners, that we've really got the highest priority areas. For someone that lives in the Willamette Valley, I look at the Willamette River and how many crossings do we have in Corvallis, in Albany, in Salem, in Newburgh, where the hospital's on one side and crossed by a bridge of a state highway, and the communities on the other side, or a big portion of the communities on the other side. What are we doing in those communities to, at least in that central Willamette Valley, have one or two crossings that we can depend on to get across the Willamette River? So that kind of thinking at a local level, I think, is one thing we'll see that comes out of this triage effort, and I'm kind of excited about the possibilities of that and how we can gain some synergy with our local partners in moving the agenda forward. So just as a status report, I kind of went back to 2012 and talked about the Seismic Plus, what the triage work we've been doing. If we took a snapshot today and just where we are, again, that's a little hard to see, but the 97 and 58 there in the blue that you see, that is all funded. We still have work to do. The little green piece of 97 there around Bend down to 58, that is actually complete. So that starts to color in that phase 1 map of where we are. Highlighted in yellow there over on the coast, you'll see Seal Rock and Coos Bay are funded. We're working through, or at least partially funded, so we're working through the process on those two. As I mentioned before, Astoria site did not receive any funding in the legislative session. And then the triage piece in Southern Oregon was funded as part of House Bill 2017 there in Southern Oregon. So our next priority as we start building future STIPs will be filling in the rest of that phase 1, moving through the Willamette Valley as our next priority to start connecting those. And then, as I said, the triage work, once we get that together, put a strategy together on how we do that. So here's just a order of magnitude if you look at just the phase 1 bridges. So the part that's not funded or remaining is really I-5 through the Willamette Valley, through the Portland area, and then through the gorge. Obviously the hardest areas of that phase 1 with the number of bridges and the number of just geological issues that we have. 97 and 58 were the easy ones, and funded those and completed that part of the work first. In the backdrop of all this, as I mentioned earlier, is the condition of our bridges. And so as you talk about seismic kind of in isolation, it's pretty easy to start talking about the needs you need and the funding you need and the prioritization. But in the backdrop, we have this condition of our system and the condition of our bridges. And we're gonna have, you'll see further presentations as we talk about that in future meetings. But just as, you know, as a snapshot, even with House Bill 2017, we have a declining condition of our bridges, which impacts our seismic program, which means that as we come across and want to do a seismic upgrade in, say, phase 1, we can't do a retrofit on the bridge because the bridge isn't healthy enough. We actually have to do a replacement of that bridge. And so the cost to our bridge program and the cost to the seismic program is up, and we make less progress. That graph on the bottom there, I think, is a good illustration of kind of where we are. We made a major investment, obviously, in OTO3 to our bridges. And that's where you see at the top there, the number of poor bridges have actually gone down. But what that illustrates is the more bridges we have in that kind of fair condition heading towards poor, you've got this cliff coming up in front of you, and we've made that bigger in doing kind of keeping the system, band-aiding is probably not quite the right word, but just in doing the best we can to kind of manage the condition of our bridges. We've got an increasing amount of our bridges are in that fair condition that someday are going to be all headed towards that poor condition in a hurry, which will be another issue for us to deal with. But anyway, so we've got that as a backdrop with just our bridges to deal with, and then another conversation about landslides, as well. But that's an illustration of that. So I guess the conclusion that I come to as I look at this, it seems like we're in a point in time, just in that kind of the story I shared with you, we're at a good point in time to make a transition from a place where we've done planning work and justification for additional investment in seismic to actually how do we manage a seismic program. Now that we have funding, even though it's a very, very modest level, we do have some funding for seismic, and we hopefully will have more and maybe more opportunities. But we really need policy guidance from the commission on a lot of different issues. I just mentioned to you the decision to save major bridges kind of outside of the program until the end. Is that a good approach or not? Having some discussion in a document about why that is and having some policy guidance from you. Boy, do we retrofit bridges or replace bridges? Where is that cost-benefit breakpoint between those two things? On the landslide issue, if we can get, you know, a bulldozer in and push the rocks out of the way in a couple of weeks, is that one we even worry about versus the major slide where the whole roadway is going to be gone and we can do some mitigation now versus what we saw on the coast this last winter in the Cascadia slide? Boy, that is just so big. Again, it's like those major bridges that we need a different strategy for that. So there's some key policy questions in this and partly also the conversation I was just having with the condition of our bridges. Where's that balance between seismic and bridge condition? We may suffer a little bit in doing more load rating or load restrictions for trucks today, so we can spend more on seismic in the future. Where is that kind of policy balance between those two things? We also have this triage work going on, and how do we have a statewide document then that can give policy guidance potentially to all the system, and how do we prioritize maybe state funding on the local system? How do we leverage our local bridge program and other funds that go to local governments? How do we incentivize local governments to make investments in a statewide strategy around seismic? How do we bring our local partners into that conversation so we can all 20 years from now maybe look back and say, wow, look at the progress we've made on this triage approach to both the county system and the state system. How do we do that in a kind of fair way that we're all on the same page with? So there's some work to do, you know, around that. Anyway, so I think there's some fertile ground here to, again, make that transition from a planning effort to a program effort that I would envision a planning effort similar to what we do with our freight plan, our transit plan, that the commission endorses a planning effort. We bring our stakeholders together, we get engagement from the commission at various key points, and then ultimately have a plan that's adopted by the commission that provides that direction for the state. And I think the timing's also right from that triage work that I described earlier. We're about a year away from completing that. So I think we can begin some of that other policy work as we finish that work up to timing. So I kind of leave that with you, maybe looking for some direction if that's something that is interested to you, to direct us to come back with a more specific proposal for you to kind of launch that effort on. But that's what makes sense to me as someone that's kind of worked in this for the last 10 years or so. So that's kind of where we are with the system. Maybe a few questions or discussions before we transition maybe to Mac talking more organizational issues.
I would start with thank you. That's a lot. We've come a long way from awareness to education to now action. I would submit for the commission it would be beneficial to understand the cost benefit of, okay, should we retrofit, should we rebuild, should we, what factors go into that? Is it even in the proper location? Is it,
Yep.
I mean, there are a variety of things that if we could rethink some of these decisions, would we think differently today than we did in the past? And in terms of the investment, I think we've done a great job in terms of the triage. And I really like the fact that we're thinking about it as a system and people, not necessarily ownership of roadways or infrastructure.
Right.
And that, I think, is the right way for us to be thinking, because that's solving a problem together, not worrying so much about state funds on a local system.
Right.
That local system may get us the best bang for the buck in
Right.
that investment. So I would submit that many states probably wouldn't be looking at it in such a partner type of
Yep.
lens. So understanding if we spend here, what do we get? If we retrofit, what years, you know, how many life years do we get for that asset? those sorts of pieces would be beneficial, I would suspect, but I would turn it to my colleagues, and you'll be the ones that'll be taking this information back. What would be beneficial to know in order to help guide this process?
Well, given the impact on the coastal region, I was first involved with the resiliency when it started, and I think you've come a long way to dealing with the connectivity issues that are going to be critical if there is some type of Cascadia event. I think Chair Boehne is right. There's a lot of bridges out there that, yes, some have been rehabbed, but probably not to the higher standard that they should have been, given the funding that was available at the time. So I think what the chair is talking about is what we really need to do, and that's look at those bridges. Do we maybe develop a template that says, okay, if it's this old and we've done these tests on it and this, let's just forget about rehabbing it. Let's rebuild it and rebuild it to a standard. But I think we have to be careful about that, because a Cascadia event of any significance could be followed by others over a period of time. So it's going to be very critical that we make the right decisions on these structures so that they're around for longer than the next Cascadia event. And it's all going to just take money, and a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
So I agree with you, Chair Boehne, about looking at the cost of it. I think the other piece of this, as ODOT is really starting to invest in this idea, is the partnerships with the local areas. And so one of the things that I think is lacking is our ability, and I'm looking at Mr. Weil over there, over the years, especially in the Southern Oregon area, we started working on plans. We moved with a lot of momentum. Everybody was at the top of their list of things to think about. And we slowly just kind of become complacent in really thinking about this. And I think that one of the things that we can do is in leadership is to make sure that those partnerships are really strong. And I like the idea of the triage and that you're doing on the coast, but I think you could take it even further where you have those maintenance stations set up everywhere. So
Right.
In this kind of a situation, I don't think that we can just look at the state and say, come help us. We're going to have to be prepared, and it's something that I think if we have a good plan and then we do start looking at the system as a whole, we can work together to get this done. So.
Good.
Please.
One other thing that these comments have brought to my mind is many of the coastal counties have limited highway budgets. I mean, they're not even keeping up with what needs to be done to keep the road in any operable condition over a 5 or 10 year period. So I think there's going to be a greater dependency on ODOT, and we have to realize that, because it's not going to change the economics of these communities. One asset that you do have in some of the timber communities is you have road building experience within the timber industry and with others. And I think that needs to be kind of folded into the process of what resources do we have available. And there was a discussion the other day about Carpenterville Road down there in Curry County. It's a tough road to drive, but if it's the one that survives, then it's the one that needs to be looked at.
Right.
And I was a little surprised that there wasn't a setup down probably in Brookings for one of the triage points. Because if there's a Cascadia event, I'm not sure there's going to be anything left of 101 between Brookings and Port Orford. So.
Yeah, good points. As I said, ultimately, we'd like to have all our coastal maintenance stations. We just started with those 3 I showed on the map as a starting point. Commissioner Brown, I also hear your point that it's not just the coast. All of Western Oregon and our maintenance stations, I think, are good opportunities for those staging areas for those communities. Probably just from a prioritization standpoint, we probably prioritize at the coast first and then move kind of the opposite direction towards 97, from 101 maintenance stations. But there's opportunities there for sure.
I'm just gonna go to your house and camp out.
Right, yeah. You're certainly welcome at my place. Something that kind of is an umbrella comment for this work in general is managing expectations. And I think that while a very difficult conversation to have, we're talking about lifelines and we're talking about response. And that's different. It's coupled with resiliency, yes, but that first initial approach is that response. We can't, cities, counties, state, be all things to all people in all areas. And so as this continues to evolve, there will continue to be awareness, and I know we even have the media here today. It's that collective voice of we need to focus in on the areas where we have the greatest benefit for those limited funds to be able to respond to a catastrophic event. And from there, it isn't as though the other communities are not important or that those areas are not going to be accessed. It's that we have to have a system that meets that initial response. And the thing that still raises the little hairs on my arms is when Dr. Ashford said, we are was it anywhere between 13 and 27 in terms of the variability of the actual event happening. Right. And he said, I just want to be clear that the Chile event happened at 20%. And so you don't have to be at, now we're 100% certain that this year's the year. It can happen at any time. Right. And so, and we are probably, and I'd submit, behind in our investments because we were unaware. I mean, we were, we're learning a lot. And the United States has had catastrophic events, but this will be very unique and life-changing, generation-changing, economic changing for our entire state and the western states. So that investment being strategic about those immediate lifelines, I think is the right approach. But I think we're probably, as we go forward, going to need to continue to tell the story about why.
Right. Just a couple
Please.
key points in there I just want to highlight. We didn't understand Cascadia or even know about Cascadia until the mid-'80s, even into the early '90s, as Dr. Goldfinger was talking about. When were most of our bridges built? Most of our bridges were built before that. Right. Most of our infrastructure was built before that. So that's where we're in that situation compared to Chile or Japan, where they've known about these earthquakes and experienced them on a much more frequent basis than we are.
Well, many people even doubted the research when it was coming forward. It was, no, that can't be possible. Well, in fact, yes, it can be. And so I think that's where it put, the states behind in being able to plan. But it wasn't to anyone's fault. It just was, it's so hard to comprehend the magnitude of this event and what it will mean that, of course, it was questioned. And so here we are, and we're leaning into it.
One of the other slides I've shared with you in the past that I left out of this slide deck was the work that we've done from an economic standpoint and what this is going to mean to Oregon's economy, not just for a day or two or a year or two, but for a decade or two. While we're talking about a big investment of $5 billion and more, the cost to Oregon's economy, we project to be $350 billion. To a point where you're not going to, industry and companies aren't going to have, employees aren't going to have access to markets, aren't going to have access to get there. They're going to, the ones that can pick up and leave are likely going to pick up and leave. And so then attracting those businesses back, that whole cycle to go through from Oregon's economy will have devastating effects on us. And so how can we protect and insulate that and start by providing a minimal network for those companies to at least function at a minimal level while we bring the system back up so we don't lose them.
So it brings me to the thought around the tri-state meeting that is coming up, and I know that this will be a discussion point because it won't just, it's like any other catastrophic event, it's not going to go border to border. It's going to affect the tri-state area. The federal investment is one that has been limited. And there will be significant federal investment on the response and resilience to this event. I really encourage that engagement, and I know that there has been some discussion of that in the past with our federal delegation in the tri-state area about what can we be doing to get the lifelines up to where we feel that we are at least slightly prepared for the event,
right.
which will then help us in that response and resiliency piece. They will be spending the money. Where would they prefer to spend it? On the front end or the back end?
Right, right.
And I think we can put a federal partnership at a higher level to great use.
Good.
So that was really going to be one of my primary points was intergovernmental cooperation is critical to this, and you've described it state to local, but also state to federal for the reasons the chair mentioned. So even if there aren't programs in place, I think we need to be a little bit of a catalyst of this it's not preventative, but anticipatory investments that could be just invaluable in terms of initial response. So that's one point. And looking at all sources, public and private, and looking at, partnering with businesses and others, and how much of that we can lead on is limited, but we can perhaps provide some framework for cities and counties and other entities to be partnering up. This is really, we talk a lot about community building and our role in community building. This is really community rebuilding. And so how we do that is something we ought to be thinking about, I think. And for us, it's no more than providing guidelines and being a facilitator of conversations. That can be a really valuable role, I think. The intergovernmental role you've already described well, and I think that's essential. And for the work that this plan outlines, I think you're doing that exactly right. I agree with Commissioner Brown on the pre-staging. I remember when Gail Ackerman was on this commission, my former law partner, that one of the things she said she tried to do was get the equipment close to where things might be happening, so you weren't waiting for the equipment. Right. So if there was an accident or if there was some kind of an event, to not be waiting for a long time for the vehicles or the personnel that you need to get to a site to get there. This is kind of the same idea, to really stage it out so that you're putting resources close to need. And that's going to be even more challenging in an environment where the infrastructure is not in good shape or maybe non-existent in some places. So so I think that's important. The last thing I was going to say is I think it's important for us to reiterate to the public, just as a source, one source, and in coordination with federal, state, and local agencies that are more on the front line on this, but the need for individual preparedness. Right. I think former Director Garrett, in one of our earlier meetings on this subject, said it very well when he said, we're all responsible for getting ready, and this is on all of us, and we need to be reminding one another. My wife has gotten together with someone in our neighborhood and is organizing the neighborhood by blocks. Who has what, who knows what, where are the doctors, where are the resources in our neighborhood? And it really is at that level where people really can't be passive about this. They have to prioritize this and not just get your earthquake kit together, but also talk to the people that you live around, what's it gonna be like, because those are the people you're gonna go through it with. Certainly in the beginning, and that is not governmental, other than I think the communication piece, which is governmental. We have to get people organizing for this in a very active way and right now, because as the chair said, we don't know if this is coming this afternoon or it's coming 100 years from now, but it's coming.
Yeah. Good. So good discussion. I appreciate the input. I'm going to take all that input as a yes, come back with a proposal about how we wrap these different issues together and approach this transition from a plan to a program, and how we deal with some of these issues. So we'll be back to you in the next few months with that. So from that, we'll transition to Mac, and he's going to go through kind of the organizational readiness and continuity issues that we have.
So hopefully it's not a sign, best laid plans. I left all my documents as props in the trunk of the car. So I think that's the point of, you can do all the planning and preparedness that you can, and you still have that moment of forgetting it in your trunk. So I think Commissioner Van Broecklyn, your comments around the personal side of this is front and center. And when I think about it, it's how does that translate to an organization the size of us? So I guess since we're in a workshop, let's have a little fun with this to start. How many of you have lost power at your home for an hour? Raise your hand, audience. A day? A week? Got 2 hands? A month? Julie? Okay. Right, so we're talking about... So when I think about that, when I was growing up as a kid, it seemed like we used to lose power frequently, and now, it's a blip on the radar anymore. And so as we think about just those conversations in your own house about being prepared for even not having power, especially now with phones and connectivity, and just how much we rely on this thing for the way we do business, the way we communicate with our kids, just how we interact. Commissioner Van Broecklyn, your comment of working with your neighbors, I think some people today don't know their neighbors. So take that personal experience to heart in terms of your level of preparedness, how frequently you're updating that and having that conversation of what if it happened today? Are our spouses and our families prepared to do things without us for a long period of time until we, most of us get north? We'll all be at Julie's house later. Yeah, hopefully. So I think about that, and the documents I was going to have in front of me are about this thick in terms of 2 large binders that is our emergency operations plan. So I'm going to give you just a high walkthrough of kind of our approach and thoughts around how we plan for all hazards, and I'll give you some examples of that. Apologies for Lucy Moore, State Maintenance Engineer, not being here. She had another commitment keeping her actually out of the country right now, so I know she was unfortunate to miss this opportunity, because that's really in her bailiwick of the organization around that emergency operations component of our work. So just reflecting back in the last 10 years, some of the things that we've had to deal with that pale in comparison to Cascadia. So we've had 8 or 9 very significant winter storms. So think back in the last 10 years. We had a tornado. Obviously had several floods. I think Vernonia maybe was a little bit before that time frame, but that's certainly one of the big ones in recent years. Obviously wildfire seasons, last summer down here in particular of note, and knock on wood, today we're having an okay summer. The eclipse, not something we think of as a hazard, but certainly the approach of how we had to manage so many people coming into our system, certainly in the central Oregon area in that band of the full eclipse not too long ago. We had the Mosier train incident with the fire, certainly learned from. And then we can look no further back than just a few months ago with February storms, and then of course the Who's Canadian slide, as Paul just mentioned. All of those, in my opinion, pale in comparison to what we're going to experience in a Cascadia event, even if you added them up together. So just kind of putting that in context. So our emergency operations plan, the picture on the left is one of our trailers that we actually stage in Region 4 in the Bend compound that we're able to deploy mobily. I'll talk a bit about that later in the presentation. But just in terms of how are we prepared to execute a plan to prepare for, respond to, and recover from all hazards. So a lot of those examples I rattled off for you, how do we take that same approach to something the size of Cascadia, knowing that it's going to stretch us beyond anything we've seen previously? And putting some of the bureaucratic things in place, if you will. agreements, roles and responsibilities, authorities. We'll end a bit with a discussion with the commission around what your authority is in terms of the governor's role, in terms of authorities that we distribute across the agency, knowing that likelihood the Salem headquarters area will be out of network for a while. And so how do we mobilize those resources to the Redmond Bend area, as Paul mentioned earlier? What kind of tools can we put in place to be flexible? We generally don't operate very flexible in government, but I think the triage strategy we just talked about on the infrastructure side is a great example of those opportunities we're going to have to look for in the moment, and maybe not be so concerned about the risk because we've done the upfront work to say who's paying for what at the end of the day. So just kind of that discipline, that Bible, that playbook, if you will, is something we refer to and pull out often, but probably not often enough. It's a little bit like that conversation you'd have at your home. You're probably not having it as often as you should, and not refreshing and updating your supplies on a regular basis. That's a challenge we certainly have across an agency the size of us. So just speak a little bit, Andrew Phelps and Mike Harriman, when they were in front of you, spoke to a little bit of the role of the state in an emergency response society as a Cascadia. Certainly, our authorities will remain in place, but we're going to serve the larger need of the state in coordination with our governor's office. We're on the cabinet, we're at the table, not only in the preparedness aspect, but certainly as we respond and recover from it. And I would highlight the agreements. So we've got a lot of agreements in place, long-standing, that help facilitate our role in a hazard environment, that we'll rely on those for the Cascadia event as well. One I'd mentioned that's relatively new, Hal Gard, Rail and Public Transit Division Administrator, has been working with the railroads around reciprocity agreements. And if he were here, he'd share Burlington Northern, they're having a lot of really productive discussions in terms of getting an agreement in place so that we're able to provide rock, for instance, to them as they mobilize their railroad resources to bring more equipment and materials into Central Oregon and as far as they can. So I just want to highlight that, work that's going on with Hal. So as we go ahead, sorry.
If you go back one slide, please. On the agreements in place, has there been any consideration to, for example, the telecom community as a component of making sure that there is communication ability between the impacted areas of the state and the Redmond response area?
Commissioner Keller, I'm not sure to the specifics. I know when we think about the state radio project, state radio program, that's where we're investing a lot of time and energy in that network of radio interoperability for OSP, for ODOT, for the cities and counties that are on that system for EMS response. Certainly a lot of work there. And I believe at the Office of Emergency Management under Andrew Phelps' direction, that's where I think some of those conversations are happening around, especially the cellular connectivity that we see as such an important aspect. So can't speak to the specifics, but I know that's in kind of that sphere of preparedness, if you will, for that larger infrastructure. I think the biggest concern we hear is that IT component. We're obviously experiencing some network challenges right now, as you know, and Bob Gephardt and I were having a conversation this morning, just the thousands of hits we're getting, if you will, attacks on our system. Cybersecurity is obviously becoming a much bigger component of our work than it ever used to be. So in a Cascadia event, will we have that capability even in the state? Will the Western U.S. have that capability? What's the exposure we will have in the breach of that system and be able to connect back to that? So it sort of makes my head spin a little bit in terms of this sounds like a disaster movie, and I think we will be in that place and have to recover accordingly. So from the system aspect, this is truly one of those multimodal opportunities, and the way we think about it, I'll say from the pictures, we're missing that aviation and that port marine environment, but certainly the way we think about the system today in terms of our planning and how we manage it with our partners, it's going to be no different in terms of a hazard or a Cascadia event. It's going to take all those tools in place. I love the comment, the railroad will build faster than we would ever imagine. We'll see if that happens or not. in terms of what's going to happen in the marine environment, of mobilizing those resources. I think there were some humorous comments earlier this spring about the Navy doing some tasks out on the coast and landing craft on the beach. I think, Paul, you were mentioning, was it Dr. Goldfarb, I believe, was on the beach that day and was a little surprised, and so they were testing it, right? So in terms of how do they deploy the resources that come into the state, and then of course how do we have those critical infrastructure connections? And Tillamook's a great example, I believe. It seems like every winter they flood, so they've obviously had a lot more exposure to that. But you know, as those landing crafts come in, then how do you deploy that, or how do you move it from the airport out into where the need is at? So how do we think about the system? The bridge picture, I can't overemphasize that enough. That will certainly be a big component of our response and recovery, is how do we get out there and look at a bridge to determine can we get across it or not. So we'll be deploying a tremendous amount of resources and assets to just looking at that from a fracture critical perspective of, can we get even one vehicle across that? Can people walk across that? Let alone can we get heavy equipment across that? So just, there's a whole lot of aspects to this. I think our ODOT role, and we obviously have authority and ownership over a lot of these pieces. We have some regulatory role as well, but we also are going to play a liaisoning role. For me, the railroads, the transits, the ports, the aviations, we're going to be in that liaisoning role, relying on those partnerships and connections to ensure that we know what their system's like and how we can best leverage that and fold it into the incident command structure as we look at the broader response across the state, and more than likely, to Commissioner or Chair Bainey's comment, across the entire West. This isn't going to just hit us. So just flag that.
And Mac, that also goes to the interoperability around the radio systems. And I know we had an offline conversation about this, but even as transit providers are looking at investments in their radio systems and et cetera, how that all plays into an overall connection to the state system will determine a good outcome in terms of communication. So I don't know where that conversation might be had, but we'd want to make sure that they're not making investments in isolation, that there's somehow then the interoperability opportunity.
Yeah, Chair Bainey, I appreciate you bringing that up. I've got those in later, but let's just touch on that now. We're always looking for how do we best prepare that system for resiliency. So when we build it, are the towers going to stay up? That's obviously foundational, but how do we connect? And so we're making improvements to that system, and it's way too geeky for me to even understand. But at a basic level, it may be somebody with the transit radio sitting in the same room, somebody with the OSP radio. I mean, we can go that basic, right? Kind of the old CB days, but hopefully in many locations we'll have that interoperability. And we do have that today in many locations, and we're continuing to expand that as new partners come on board. So just heard the other day we're about ready to expand that interoperability in the northeastern corner of the state. I know Deschutes County came on board recently with interoperability. So we're always looking for that opportunity. But the backbone, they call it the trunk line, is really that foundation, and we've built redundancy to have that both in Salem and in Bend. But so much of that infrastructure relies on, do we have the network? And so it's obviously a complex situation, but I think in some locations we'll see old school efforts, and in some locations we'll have a little bit more dynamic interoperability. So spoke a little bit to this in my opening comments, but just we use really any opportunity to learn. The plan we've assembled together identifies, in my opinion, really kind of basic approach to how big is the hazard, even to hazmat type things like we experienced in Mosier, to terrorist attacks. So how do we think about our response and plan for those events that may occur? And obviously, winter storms is something we do on a more regular, routine basis, but our capacity to even deal with something like we had this last February can really be stretched thin when it happens across the entire state. So how can we just be best prepared? To Paul's comment earlier, the landslide piece, put that picture in there on purpose. Some of these, we truly are not gonna, we're not gonna bolster that up. It's just, the funding is not going to be there. So how do we think about, to Commissioner Callery's comment, detour routes like Carpenterville? What's the minimum level of investment we can make so it's a viable option to a community that will be in need? And we've got those across our geological formations in this state, especially on the west side. So just learning from those experiences, I think the key point I'd mention is just how do we think about action after action reviews, lessons learned. This is never a one and done, especially as we change our workforce. So many of our folks have been around for a long time, and hey, we had that incident back 20 years ago, and this is what we learned. And so how do we just continue to share that message and knowledge base, especially when we're going to have communities cut off, and how do they get access to equipment and materials? So from an operations business continuity perspective, certainly the seismic side, that mitigation, how can we become more resilient, investing in that pieces that Paul was talking to, the preparedness aspect, we do tabletop exercises. Let's face it, that's a commitment of resources that's taking away from other opportunities. So balancing that, that picture is actually in our TLC building there in Salem that becomes the agency operations center with a whole lot of people in the room trying to map out what's the response going to be for something that large. The response, certainly that's that 1 to 2 days into several weeks, just life, liberty, if you will. And that's, I think, where we're going to see that's community partners, that's your neighbor, that's being in the community. And we saw that specifically in Region 3 in February with the big storm. Highway 38 is a great example. The story of plow drivers having a family have a tree fall in the car right behind them, and sharing food, sharing clothes, just that sense of community is going to be overwhelming, and it's going to be required in many locations. And then, of course, to recovery, it's going to take a while, as we've spoken to, but there's a picture of Who's Canadian. We at least got one lane open, at least so we could get some fuel and hospital services through, but it's going to take a monumental effort. Just thinking about how big that slide alone was, we're going to have multiples of those, so just in context. I want to talk just a little bit about business continuity. There's a whole lot of things that we're going to need to do in the hours, days, weeks after something the size of Cascadia, but I wanted to touch briefly on DMV, maybe an overlooked area of our agency in terms of what their needs are going to be. And I think we can go, well, why would somebody need to go get a driver's license or renew their vehicle registration after an event like that in the days following it? But let's back up to safety. So people are going to be missing. So how does law enforcement access their system to find out what Julie Brown's address is, or who is Julie Brown? Yeah. There's a fun story apparently around that I heard last night. So they've got redundant systems in place that, back in the day it was a CD, it was a thumb drive. Now they've got automated systems behind the firewall, if you will, between OSP and that LEDS system, the law enforcement database system. So they've got redundant systems in place that work offline. So when the network's down for who knows how long, that they're still able to access that information. They've also got a tremendous amount of folks across the state, just like we do in the Highway Division. So how do they deploy those and have a plan to deploy those folks in remote locations, as well as operate some of those core processes from the Bend, Redmond area or other places? So that safety component for the DMV infrastructure, I can't overemphasize in terms of what they're going to be asked to do in that immediate days following. And then people are going to not have ID, right? People are going to lose things, and so they're going to need to have a place from a customer relations standpoint, customer service standpoint, to come in and get a temporary ID so they can start to reassemble their life and move forward. So a lot of work done in the DMV side to just be prepared for that business continuity aspect. Certainly on the IS, IT, infrastructure side, I've spent a lot of time with the DAS component, just ensuring that we've got redundant systems in place. And many other areas of our agency, we certainly focus on that. But just wanted to highlight some of those DMV items in particular. Getting close to the end here, we obviously have a lot of facilities, equipment, people that we can deploy. So that picture on the left is our mobile command center that we stage in Bend. That's got a trailer. It's set up to be a mobile command center, so we can operate and utilize that remotely. Certainly our state radio program can't emphasize that enough. We experienced some of those challenges this last winter with running out of power, to serve those facilities, and the generators only have a fuel supply for so long. So what can we do to better prepare those? As we've built that system out, we've built it to seismic standards, but those microwave antennas you see are going to be out of alignment. So how do we get folks out there to tweak? Yeah, they're gonna shift a little. Hopefully everything's still up, but we're gonna have to have somebody out there realigning it. And then just our equipment. So to Paul's comments earlier, how are we staging our equipment in appropriate locations? And let's face it, we're not going to have much warning, so it's not like we can tell folks to run out there and move stuff around, but just we've got a ready access to a fleet of equipment, and we've got folks that can repair and keep them moving. Fuel is something that I cannot overemphasize enough. I think that you've heard that and through multiple workshops. We obviously have a large fuel supply, but we're a large fuel user. And so as we run out of power in locations, how do we get the fuel out of those tanks? And so some pretty creative ways of pumping that manually, using battery-powered pumps. Just we're going to get creative, and many of our locations who experience those delays now are used to that. But we're going to become the fuel supply for a lot of the recovery efforts. In Drain, love this example from earlier this year in the community of Drain just north. There was one gas station, no power, but that guy had a generator, and he was willing to handwrite tickets for us because he knew we were the ones out there responding to the community. So we're going to see those types of things happen. But fuel in the West Coast environment of the Cascadia conversation is probably the biggest thing I hear people get nervous about, just our capacity to store it in the Portland area, liquefaction concerns, the pipeline concerns. Just I think that's the one thing that Lucy and her team continually do impress upon the rest of the agency is fuel is going to be that priority for us. So get close to the end with just how do we maintain our level of preparedness. I'm glad we picked this picture because this is our Region 3 team. You may recognize a couple of folks that you met yesterday. Nice coincidence. They're working in the TIMS training, which is how do we ensure we've got our incident management and transportation system coordinated. I'm not sure which project in particular. It may have been the one you saw yesterday, or it may have been the opening of the Highway 62 Expressway. But how do we maintain that level of preparedness? That's going to be a challenge, and it always will be a challenge, no different than it is in your home. But having our partners around the table, get the maps out. Let's talk about where would we bulldoze that thing? Where would we stage a culvert? How could we get around? So maintaining that level of preparedness. And then lastly, as we think about just the role of the commission, I think to Paul's comments more on the left is how do we prepare that resiliency approach of how do we prioritize the funding? How do we balance that against all the other needs? What are the budgetary priorities, for instance, to expand maintenance facilities to prepare to stage that on the coast? How are we responding? We're certainly going to be a resource to the governor and really to the federal entity that's going to be helping. And then in that recovery, we're going to be reprioritizing a lot of funding to try to put the most bang for the buck where we're going to recover. And it's going to be a long-term effort, as Paul was mentioning. So that is my slides. End on that one with OSP and us at a fire. Certainly those partnerships we get to leverage every day will be what's going to make us successful.
Good, so that completes our three-part series on seismic. It sounds like a to-do list for us is to come back with that approach to a seismic plan, to our seismic program. And we will, work on that and bring that back in the next several months.
Thank you very much. We won't have all the answers, but I know that through being thoughtful about the process and engaging partners, we'll be able to be as prepared as possible. So thank you so much for the commitment of time. Okay, shall we go on to the next part of our agenda? We don't have questions. Colleagues, do you have further questions on this particular topic or comments? Okay. Thank you, Mac. So I will turn it over to you, Director Mather, in terms of the director's report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have one thing I want to highlight for the commission. It's from DMV. They've accepted an AAMVA regional award. DMV Administrator Tom McCullen and NSTP Communication Lead Lauren McCullen accepted a regional award at this year's American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators Region 4 Conference in Denver. The entry Oregon DMV Online Open House won in the Public Affairs and Consumer Education category. The goal of the open house were to educate and build awareness among customers about the importance of the STP program at DMV. The online open house offered digital stations where people could learn more about the innovations underway. Participants could choose to watch DMV videos, learn more about current efforts at DMV and options that were under consideration, as well as complete a more formal survey. DMV was able to save on travel and logistic costs, as well as reduce the time investment of staff for this crucial period. In total, some 40,000 people attended the online open house and posted a combined 467 reactions and comments. So it's an example of, I think, ODOT learning from each other. This is an approach that we take in project development quite often, and DMV looked at that and said, you know, we could apply that to our STP program, and why don't we try something here? And they not only did that, but probably took it to different levels than we've taken it anywhere in the agency, to a point that they got recognized nationally for that work. So outstanding work for Tom and his crew at DMV.
You say those numbers again? 40,000?
So yeah, 40,000 people, and the comment numbers were 467 comments or reactions. So pretty productive as you think about going around the state and trying to get people to come to you in a traditional open house setting. You get maybe 6 or 10 people showing up. Being able to leverage that online presence and gain that kind of exposure and input is pretty impressive.
Typically in those smaller open house style events, it's usually those that are most informed that show up to further inform themselves. And so it's important that we have a broader reach. That's impressive. Thank you.
Yeah, very. Thank you. That concludes my report. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Next, we have public comment, and at this point, it's my understanding that we don't have anyone signed up, but if you want your opportunity, now is your chance. Okay, seeing the crowd going wild, everyone just fighting to get to the front. We will go on to, actually, I'm going to move on to item D. Vice Chair Van Broecklyn needed to step away for just a few moments, so Travis and Chris, I'll go ahead and call you up. So this is a discussion about redistribution and the allocation of federal aid highway program funds for fiscal year 2019.
Madam Chair, members of the Commission, for the record, I'm Travis Brower, ODOT's Assistant Director, and we are here to talk to you about how we get to spend some unanticipated federal dollars that are coming our way. So for some background, ODOT, as we're building the STIP, we make an estimate of the total amount of federal funding we're going to get every year. We did this back in 2015, and as you can imagine, when you're doing that for, say, 4 years in advance, that is at best a wild guess that is informed by a variety of factors. When Congress passed the FAST Act a little bit later, we re-estimated the amount based on the authorized funding levels in that bill. But then every year we basically have to do a true-up against the amount that we anticipated versus the amount after all the puts and takes that the federal government provides. One of the key factors is that for FY 2018 and FY 2019, there was a budget deal between Congress and the White House that put additional money into infrastructure. As a result of that, we got more money this federal fiscal year than we originally had anticipated because Congress just appropriated more money. So we will take that. Then there's another factor. At the end of every federal fiscal year, FHWA takes all of the money that has not yet been obligated to projects. Some of that comes from grants that didn't spend the money they anticipated, and they redistribute it all across the country. We always make some estimate of our anticipated redistribution in the STIP. But this year, because we had already estimated at a certain funding level, due to that budget deal, we'd already gotten pretty much the amount that we estimated. So the redistribution funds that we received this year, normally those would just be folded into the STIP, and we may not even need to come to you because we would have a place to put all those. This year, though, because of that budget deal, it's basically over and above the amount we anticipated when we built the STIP. The same thing happened last year. We came back to you with that opportunity to put more projects into the STIP. So We anticipate that later this month, we will get word from FHWA about some level of additional funding from redistribution. We have no firm idea what it was. Last year, I think it was in the range of $25 to $30 million. We've received some information from FHWA that it'll be about that much. Of course, it's not necessarily the amount of redistribution we get, it's how that fits into the overall federal funding picture. So most of that will be over and above what we anticipated for this year. Those funds need to be immediately obligated. We get them at the end of August, and we get literally a week or two to find a home for it on projects. So Jeff Flowers in our STIP unit has to have a plan in place. It's a little bit of an awkward hop in between commission meetings because we have to have these monies obligated immediately before the September commission meeting, but we don't know the actual amount. So what we have brought forward to you is a plan that would allow us to obligate all those funds, and we want to get input from you, and then we'll report back as to how much we got and then where that went. So what we do when we look at this opportunity this year, just as last year, is we look at what are the things that we absolutely have to do. These are not optional, that we need additional funding for. We focus on those mandates, for example, mandates from the federal government that we may have from Congress or FHWA, from our legislature as a result of the recently completed legislative session, or legal settlements that may tie into federal law or state law, or direction from the governor. So that is how we have framed up this recommendation this time, because if we do not use unanticipated federal funding for those purposes, then we will need to go into the STIP and find somewhere else to find this money. So that could involve, as you can imagine, delaying projects, canceling projects, or finding other ways of reshuffling the deck. So it's a great opportunity when we have these things that now are must-dos. We have a funding source this year to do some of them, to contribute to those. I'm going to walk you very briefly through the 6 areas that we have recommended that the Commission dedicate these funds. Some of these are projects, others are more programmatic in nature. So the first is the West Coast Electric Highway recapitalization. You'll recall that we were one of the states that led the way in deploying fast charging infrastructure all across the state on some of our key highway corridors, primarily in the north and western portions of the state, but also all the way to Bend. That system is now reached basically the end of its expected life. There are new technologies coming on board with 2 different charging protocols. We need to replace all of those and move forward so that all the vehicles on the road now can utilize those chargers. So we had worked with the legislature and the governor's office on a way to move forward on this. The legislature gave us a little bit of match funds and basically directed us to use federal funds in order to complete the funding needed for that. This has also been a very high priority for the governor, who worked with us to ensure that we found a funding source for this. So this is that opportunity to move forward there. Another area coming out of the legislative session, just as the West Coast Electric Highway did, is the I-5 Boone Bridge. You have probably been, just like me, stuck in traffic on this numerous times. Following on the conversation from Mr. Mather, this is a seismically vulnerable bridge as well as a bottleneck, and we were directed by the legislature to do a cost-of-complete study about widening and seismically retrofitting that bridge. So an excellent opportunity to begin work on that critical project. The third area is bridge rating and strengthening. If there are any questions about this, I will turn those over to Mr. Strickler, as I am not deeply familiar with this, but suffice to say that there is a class of vehicles called specialized hauling vehicles. They are generally shorter, with a lot of axles, and they have a very specific impact on bridges. We're required to go rate all of our bridges to determine how specialized haul vehicles will be able to use them, and then in some cases we'll have to post them or strengthen them. This is a large mandate from FHWA, and we need money to go do this, or else we'll have to refocus the bridge program in order to meet the timeline that FHWA has laid out. The other area, programmatic area, you're very familiar with is ADA ramps. We have a legal settlement and federal law requiring us to put in place these ramps, and it also happens to be the right thing to do. And so we are requesting some additional money in order to ensure that we can meet our 5-year commitment. We have obviously asked and you have provided significant direct funding for this, and also a lot of money is going to ADA ramps in project budgets. The last two areas I think are very important because they relate to some of the congestion challenges we see in the Portland metro region. Coming out of the 2017 legislative session, as you're well aware, we had direction to go work on value pricing, tolling on I-5 and I-205. We did the initial work around the feasibility analysis. We funded that through the STIP, and that was completed. We are now moving into the next phase around planning and NEPA, and we have been doing an incremental funding strategy here, given that the legislature didn't give us specific funding there. So we are coming back asking you for the next phase of funding in order to engage more deeply in traffic and revenue analysis, public outreach, and planning and environmental work on that area. The last area is the Interstate 5 bridge. As you are probably aware, the governor has directed the commission to have ODOT and WashDOT work together on restarting this effort. You're also aware that the legislature just this week created a new Interstate 5 Bridge Joint Committee that will also begin working with the WashDOT and overseeing this effort as we restart this. This is all because there is a deadline from the federal government that if we do not show progress on restarting work on this project by September 30th, the federal government could require us to repay between the two states about $130 million. So our request is for funding for that restart effort. We would provide an initial contribution to this effort, and that would allow us to go to Federal Highway Administration and say, we are making good faith efforts to move this project forward, and hopefully then they would give us an extension of that deadline. So those are all of the areas, and I should note on the I-5 bridge too, it's an excellent time for us to move forward with that comprehensive strategy throughout the region on how we address congestion. We can take a corridor look across the Rose Corridor, tolling, and the Interstate 5 bridge, trying to bring forward comprehensive solutions to address the congestion that's impacting quality of life and the economy in the metro region. So all of that makes it an excellent time for us to bring this recommendation forward. The approach we've laid out here is because we don't know the actual amount that we're going to get. We've sort of provided a range. For three of these, the Interstate 5 Bridge, West Coast Electric Highway, and Boone Bridge, we put together forward a specific number. Those would be the first things that we would fund out of this. For three of these, the ADA ramps, bridge rating and strengthening, and tolling, we really have a range. We can use a little bit of money if only a little bit of money is available. We can use up to a lot of money on those. So we would ask, our approach would be to fund those three particular projects, and then after that, whatever is left, we would spread proportionally across those more programmatic efforts. That will allow us to respond very quickly when we get those redistribution funds and move forward to get those obligated and get these projects going forward.
So if we were to consider maybe increasing the amount on the Columbia River Bridge project, for instance, what are we getting for additional investment? And then we just had a discussion, of course, about the Cascadia and preparedness. Thinking of just the very basic, having the cash available, the cash is available in each one of those areas. Is there something there that we should be thinking of that these funds could be spent on, that we at least have those very basic pieces taken care of and now move on to the next piece of the actual built environment? So comments on that?
Sure, Madam Chair, members of the Commission, thank you for the question. Chris Strickler, Highway Division Administrator. The first response really is related to the bridge. So as we look at the $5 million investment or any other investment associated with that, it's really what do we get and what's the work effort that comes as part of that. Of course, that will be partnering with our partner state in Washington, but really it's the work product of reevaluating the EIS work, moving in through the environmental phase, really starting to assess the financial plan and the effects of what a financial plan for a project of that size might have on both states, as well as what opportunities might be available to us. And then again, as you go through that environmental analysis, it's transit mode, it is some of the technical details associated with that. So it's really the reevaluation and starting that effort. and really igniting a conversation around replacing the bridge and the significant work effort that comes with that.
State of Washington has put in 17.5
They,
million.
they have an initial 17.5, and then they have another kind of pending 17.5 for a total of 35 million available.
Okay. And so if the commission were interested in maybe increasing this amount or adjusting that in any way, this would be the time for us to be discussing that. So then in terms of the idea of anything on the seismic side, which seems to be, these are all very important
Right.
projects.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I just comment that, like I did in my presentation, investment in bridges is important, whether it's seismic or condition. You're really making the same investment in the condition of those bridges from a structural standpoint or a seismic standpoint. So as you look at the investment you're making here, it's that foundational work in the bridges. So when we do our seismic work comes along, it has dealt with that underlying condition of the bridge that the seismic
Okay.
money can actually go further. So they're kind of
So
hand
it's
in glove,
connected.
go
Okay, very
together.
good.
That by making an investment in bridges, you're actually helping the overall seismic agenda.
Okay. So then could we speak specifically to the cash question around that we had 3 triage areas, and I might get that slide wrong, where we had supplies ready in 3 different areas, but there were 2 areas that were not yet funded? Is this an opportunity?
From our facility standpoint,
Correct. Is
This
this, I
from a
think,
fa- yeah, from a-
Astoria, and I think you mentioned Brookings,
yeah,
because,
yeah.
so.
I think this would get us into a color money issue.
Okay,
On the maintenance
all right.
side, we're not able to use the federal funds in this way.
Okay, that's
so,
a
yeah.
great answer.
Yeah.
All right,
Yep.
just trying to get creative.
Yep.
I figured, well, we'd get all of those completed, and
Yep.
then we would move on to the next piece. So, okay, we'll take that off the table. All right. Of course, if I make that decision, what do they do? Fire me? Just throw that out.
Only for a couple more weeks.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So comments on the investment, and possibly looking to maybe increase the investment and complement the leadership that's occurring in the state of Washington as well in their investment.
So, first of all, I think to dovetail onto your comments, Madam Chair, if there is some priority expenditure that this money could be used for, that you should feel that you should bring to our attention as an alternative way to designate funding, then please do so in response to this question. So I have been thinking about the level of commitment we might make at this time, and my thought was that maybe we would, that commitment from Washington is a 2-year commitment, 17.5 a year, so a total of 35 as I understand it. So we are looking at 5 in the first year. We're not making any commitment beyond the first year at this stage, at least that we're discussing today. My thought would be to maybe increase that number to 9, which would be half of what they're putting in this year. Seemed to me that might be a better number, but certainly open to discussion with other members of the commission or you, any of you who want to weigh in on this. I just want to make sure we're sending a message of interest in moving forward on this, a lot of work ahead, and a message not just to our partner state, but a message to our citizenry that we recognize that this is a major piece of, major element of congestion relief for the state and for the western United States and also clearly for the Portland-Vancouver metro region. So what is going from 5 to 9? How do you react to that? Do you have physical sensations like you want to?
How's your blood pressure?
Are we attempting reverse peristalsis here? What are we talking about?
So in direct response, Chair Baney, Vice Chair Van Brockland, no reaction as described. I would say that a $9 million investment towards that project would be a good choice for the commission should the commission choose to go that direction. The logic is sound as it relates to the investment that Washington has come forward with, and the one-year investment or the one-year lean into that investment, as suggested, I think is a good option going forward. And candidly, as you start to look at a project or a program really that is of that size, you start to have questions around phasing and finance plan, et cetera, as I mentioned before. And that takes money and effort and cooperation and coordination in order to answer those questions. And so it would be a reasonable investment to go forward with.
Great. So looking for direction, and again, we have 3 that would be firm numbers and the others would be as dollars are available. So there is a proposal to increase the Interstate Columbia River Bridge to $9 million. And I think that is a wise decision. I think it does send a message that we recognize the commitment that'll be necessary, and we want to see the work get started. I think we need a motion in order to approve those numbers and amend the document in reference to the redistribution funding package.
So moved.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank
Okay,
you.
gentlemen, thank you. Okay, so Vice Chair Van Brocklin, we will go back to the discussion of the director search status, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Okay, so we're moving forward toward a conclusion. Paul can wipe that smile off his face, but he can't. So where we are today is that we are moving toward interviews with the finalists. We now have finalists. We are moving this at this stage from the search committee, where it has been since February, March, to the full commission. So as we move to that stage, the chair will be chairing this next phase in terms of the full commission doing interviews with the finalists, and through the remainder of her term, chairing meetings of the commission with respect to deliberating. And as we make the chair transition, I'm going to first say that Chair Bainey's been involved in this process all the way through, is a critical member of the commission with respect to it. And so whenever we get to the point where we have selected a new director and we have gone through the reference check and all of the other things we need to do and get it to a point where we can make a public announcement on it, I've suggested to Chair Bainey that she and I do that together, no matter when it happens. So I want to kind of take that issue off the table if it is an issue, that we will make a public announcement on this at the appropriate time together. Now, when will the appropriate time be? A little hard to predict. But we will, this I can tell you, we will be, fellow commissioners, moving to a transportation partners discussion in Salem on Monday, August 26th. That's a week from this coming Monday. That will be a session that will run from 5 to 8, roughly. It might run a little over 8. I would like the commissioners to all be at the Salem Convention Center at 4:30. I know that the chair has got a commitment in Central Oregon that may push her closer to 5, but for everyone else, if you could get there at 4:30, that would be perfect. Michelle has all the details, and she will be communicating further to you, but for purposes of this meeting, 4:30, ahead of the meeting, which will start at 5, 4:30 at the Salem Convention Center. We will then, and this is a little bit of a variation on what we had planned before, we will then spend the night in Salem. We'll not be going up to Portland. We'll spend the night in Salem. Then we will have a meeting all day on Tuesday the 27th. The governor is meeting with each of the finalists that morning with her senior staff, Brendan, Nick Blosser, and others, and with Katie Koba, DAS director. Those meetings will be early in the day. Simultaneous with those meetings going on, we'll be meeting to bring the entire commission up to speed, which I think will take a couple of hours, on the kind of state of play and who these candidates are, answer any questions. That will be in a executive session we will go into on Friday morning, and I'm thinking 9 o'clock at the Department of Transportation. Michelle will get us the room, but that's where we'll be, starting at 9 on the 27th, and then we will be, after they've met with each individually with the governor, we will then, as a full commission, be meeting and interviewing as a full commission each of the finalists. And then once that is done, and the candidates are, candidate interviews have been completed, we will begin and perhaps complete our deliberations late afternoon, early evening of the 27th. And if we don't complete them, then we'll carry that discussion forward to a time certain thereafter. There will be, once we've selected someone, there will be several steps. So there'll be a reference check step. There'll be ensuring that we're making the offer correctly, that we're in discussion with the selected candidate about what the basic terms of that offer are, any points where we need to negotiate. A lot of this contract is not subject to negotiation, but some of it is. And so there won't be a lot of deal points, for lack of a better word, but there'll be some discussion about that. Then obviously we need to get acceptance. So this may take several days, and during those days the chair position may move, but we will continue to work together, and Tammy will continue to be involved all the way through. So then, and Sharon will become involved if it goes into Commissioner Smith, if it goes into September, and we'll bring Commissioner Smith up to speed. So the one kind of new feature of this is we were hoping to have the confirmation proceeding at the legislative days in mid-September. It's now become apparent that we will not be able to get notice out in time to do that. So that will move the Senate Rules Committee and full Senate's confirmation proceeding to November. We need to work through what that means in terms of onboarding the new person, the new director, and in terms of Paul's tenure as deputy director, and we'll just figure all that out. And I don't know enough about it yet to tell you exactly what that means. Other than we might ask you to be with us a little longer, and hopefully you'll say yes if that comes to be the case, which it looks like it's going to. But still figuring out the details of that. So we'll just work through that once we have more information. And then we'll be onboarding the new director, either in the interim when Paul leaves, but before Senate confirmation as deputy director, or just wait until Senate confirmation, subject to Senate confirmation, or just wait until we're through Senate confirmation. That, of course, will require consent by the selected new person, new director, and so that's part of the conversation. His or her situation with respect to their existing employment, and so it will all be worked out. It's just I can't tell you today exactly what the dates will be for those transitions. I would predict we would have a new director starting and working at the agency, I hope, not later than December 1st. But it's going to be sometime late this year, I suspect. So that's the update. And questions from any of the commissioners?
So what you're outlining.
But no questions from Paul.
It's your standard private sector hiring process.
Yeah, this is the way we do it downtown.
So, or maybe this is the public sector hiring process for an executive. I think one point of clarification, so for those that may be listening in on today's meeting or that may be here, the meetings in Salem are, for the selection and hiring of an executive, are not public meetings. For the meetings on the 26th, we will not be as a quorum. We will be in individual rooms. We will be facilitating a discussion with partners, with candidates, but unfortunately, as you can imagine, opening that to the general public, we have had a number of touch points into this process for the general public. This is just one that would need to be coordinated in a manner in which we can facilitate a dialogue that's coordinated in a way to get information out. So thank you for that, please.
So just to add to that, so the meeting on the 26th is a by invitation only meeting. And it's not a public meeting, as the chair said, and we will not be in a quorum. We will not be deliberating towards a decision in that meeting. It will just be as Tammy's described.
And then on the 27th, we will be in executive session as directed with the Department of Justice so that we can, for the purposes of hiring an executive, be afforded that opportunity as a commission to discuss, deliberate, and interview. So thank you for that. And I would like to just take this opportunity again for Mr. Mather, for you coming out of retirement to assist us through this process. It certainly is giving us the confidence and ability to carry forward. So thank you for working with us through this. Okay, any other questions or comments?
Questions of me?
Ideas? Please.
I also should say, just to get this on the record, that we really appreciate the involvement of ODOT HR, DAS HR, Oregon Department of Justice, Bonnie in particular, the OTC administrative staff, and the governor's office, particularly Brendan Fenn, for all working very collaboratively with us to get to this stage. It's been a long process, and I also want to recognize our outside consultant, Korn Ferry, they've done a spectacular job. So a really good team working on this.
Mr. Finn, as a member of the search committee, any comments that you would add?
No, just thank you. It has been a long process, but a good one, and quite transparent and inclusive. So I appreciate the commission's indulgence to that, as it was a big priority for the governor as we move forward. And yes, we just did a little of the sausage making of the process. Sometimes the legislative days won't land exactly as we might like as far as this process is concerned. I know in the last agency director hiring I was involved in, it was the same process where we had hired a director, but legislative days weren't for another month, so that director came on as an interim director, and then as just kind of a proceeding, went to the confirmation at that point. So that's also something for the commission and the governor to consider as well.
Yeah, and I could see that happening. I just can't.
So I just wanted to make Paul smile.
Yeah,
So
Paul's feeling better already.
Look at that sense of relief.
So it all depends on what the selected candidate, what their views of this are, because we would certainly look at that option if it were available to us. So just can't predict it right now.
Thanks.
Yes. Okay, next we will move on to item E, approving the amended Oregon Highway Plan to adopt alternative mobility targets for the I-5 exit 48 Rogue River interchange. Ms. Bohard, well, shall I turn it to you?
Yes,
Wonderful.
please. So good morning, Commissioners. For the record, my name is Jerry Bohard. I'm the Transportation Development Division Administrator. I'm just going to set the stage a little bit and then turn it over, really talk specifically about the project, and Tom Guevara from our region staff will do that. Some of you might, just a little history, and I don't think Commissioner Brown was here, but actually back in September, so almost a year ago, Eric Havik and Michael Rock really came to you and spoke to you about alternative mobility standards, and that was because at that point in time you actually also had one that you approved that time and then one that you've approved the next month. So you've actually approved, when I look through the records, 5 alternative mobility targets for different communities in the last probably 5 years. So it is something that is provided for in the Oregon Highway Plan. We had done some updates, so there's a process that's outlined in there, and it's really done as part of a long-range plan, and so you're gonna hear Tom talk about that with regards to the interchange. I think, you know, certainly there's been a lot of conversation today around what's happening in the Portland area, but also need to recognize that we're not necessarily meeting the mobility targets that we have throughout the state for different reasons. And we're actually looking out in our long-range plans, we're really looking out 20 years and we're going, so what's going to happen to the traffic? What's going to be the population? What does that look like? And will we be able to meet those needs? I think what's really important about the alternative mobility discussion is that we do it collaboratively with the local government that's involved. So they're understanding the implications of doing these mobility targets. I will tell you that as we were thinking about the update of the Oregon Transportation Plan and the Highway Plan, we're already starting to do some work around this issue. So we actually just closed an RFP around a mobility paper to really get a sense of what have we been doing, where, you know, sort of the status that will allow us to move forward. We're actually also in a joint effort with Metro and Region 1, looking at what we might want to do from an alternative mobility standard around the Portland area so that we don't end up doing all of this piecemeal. And then finally, what I would say, as you hopefully make a motion to approve this as an amendment to the Oregon Highway Plan, I think you may have a note that we want to make sure as you do that amendment that you also are approving the findings that are associated with that. So that becomes very important should we have any questions, although my understanding is this is not a controversial one. The other is that we actually have a second alternative mobility project on consent number 5, number 7. And I would ask that you also pull that one and make a similar motion so that we're really clear that you're also approving the findings when you make that decision. So with that, I will turn it over to Tom.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. I'm Tom Guevara, Region 3 Transportation Planner. I serve 2 roles with the City of Rogue River's Transportation System Plan. This is actually their planning document. One was I was managing as ODOT's project manager on this, and also as a member of the city's Public Advisory Committee. The committee was made up of Jackson County city staff, and through the development process, we exhausted all reasonable solutions to identify transportation improvements for the Rogue River interchange. And what we found was with all the improvements, which are basically safety improvements, all we can do is identify projects that would keep traffic queues from backing up on the I-5. None of the improvements address capacity. So the city of Rogue River is located in southern Oregon, in Jackson County. It is located in between exits 58 in Grants Pass and exits 45 in unincorporated Jackson County. Just a little bit of background about the interchange. It was built in 1960. It's characterized as a depressed type diamond configuration at Depot Street. The reason this slide's important in the picture, what made Rogue River unique is we had situations that exist in this community that don't exist anywhere else on I-5. One is you had the railroad tracks on the north, and you had the Rogue River on the south side. And those physical constraints is what prevented us from looking at capacity improvements. So what we looked at was traffic safety, what we call the interchange influence area. All these red dots represent important intersections that affect each other. What we were able to identify as traffic flows occurs, you started getting bottlenecks, and these bottlenecks were what were causing traffic queues to back up, which in essence caused traffic queues to back up on I-5 mainline. When we looked at the forecast in our analysis, we looked at 3 scenarios, which is the no build, which we don't do anything. We looked at the local street improvements, and we looked at local and the interchange improvements. We identified in all 3 scenarios that We are over 1.0 volume to capacity. ODOT's performance target for the interchange is 0.85. So at that point, we needed to identify an alternative mobility target. There was a number of local improvements that what we saw were bottlenecks that were occurring when you reached the city system, and the close proximity to the ramps is what caused traffic queues to back up. Here's another one that they're all related. By improving the bottlenecks on the local system, the city agreed to do these projects to help improve traffic safety at the interchange. And here's a third one. This was a main bottleneck that occurs in the city. By improving this intersection, what we also found that we were able to move traffic quicker from the ramps, but also it caused traffic to get to the ramps faster. So ODOT's projects pretty much looked at how do we add storage capacity to the interchange ramps. We looked at a project at the northbound ramp. We have a project on the southbound ramp. The purpose of those two projects is to keep traffic queues from backing up onto the main line. So what we proposed with the city's resolution in support of this was that the alternative mobility target for the Rogue River interchange be 1.0 volume to capacity for 4 hours of the day. The picture there is, I didn't know what 1.0 VC, basically 1.0 VC means we're at maximum capacity, means congestion. So the city would be able to allow some growth to occur, yet they would experience congestion for 4 hours of the day. That's the end of my presentation, unless you have any questions.
That last statement is significant. And as we started on this journey around allowing more congestion, if you will, in order to meet community needs, those were changes from standards to targets back around access management and the mobility, what were the standards, alongside our city-county partners in being able to say there's a give and take here. But what the worry was at that time, and I think it just shows up in my blood pressure right now, is when we're no longer here, because other people are now in our seats, and someone made a commitment that we were going to accept this level of congestion, what type of discussions or memorializing those commitments that the city and county partners recognize that we are going into this, allowing them with the additional congestion, and that they are committing to understanding that that's what we're allowing? How do we, and maybe I'm not saying that entirely correctly, but I wouldn't want in 5 or 10 years for the local jurisdictions to come back to ODOT and say, you've failed us, this is failing, and now we have an issue and we need extra funding because we have an area that is a challenge. Thoughts on that?
So I'll let Thomas speak specifically to this one, but that is exactly the purpose of the interchange area management plan. So both entities are adopting something that requires a public process in order to make that change. So if the commission 5 years from now wanted to do something different, you couldn't just make any changes to that interchange. You've put a expectation in place about how the interchange will be managed. And so you would have to work with that local government.
Okay.
They would have to change whether they've done typically this is for them a refinement plan, or they've incorporated it specifically into their transportation system plan. So they too would have to go through a public process so that the citizens would understand the changes that we're making. So that's the collaborative part of it, is that neither can unravel it without the support of the other side.
Okay, very good, thank you. That puts a bow on it. Okay.
And you're making a great point. I think that was our concern working with the current city council, is as councils change, policies change. And one of the things that is a fact in the TSP and was identifying that a new interchange, moving one north or south, we have the same issues. It's between the tracks and the river. So a new interchange really wasn't possible. And then widening out the interchange to, really the issue here is increasing the distance between the ramps, and widening out Depot Street to 5 lanes isn't a practical solution at this location. So that was part of the discussions with the current city staff was, would you accept some level of a congestion and looking at some local street improvements? And at this point, they do. We do recognize that we need to come up with a bigger solution. Part of the things that were talked about was improving the interchanges at 45, moving freight traffic down to 45, and then putting an overcrossing. But this solution here within the TSP at least gives us 20 years, so the city is allowed to grow, but we have not tabled the long-term solution permanently.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you.
So we have before us 2 pieces. One would be if it's the will of the commission to pull item 7 from the consent agenda and take action on that item as well. So what is the will of the commission?
That's fine.
Okay, great. So I would welcome a motion.
Yes, Chair Boehning, I'd like to make a motion to amend the Oregon Highway Plan to adopt alternative mobility targets for the Interstate 5 exit 48 Rogue River interchange in accordance with the findings and compliance in Exhibit B.
Okay, any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
I'd also like to make a motion, now I'm gonna slaughter this, and then let's see how well I know the Salem area. But I'd like to make a motion on consent item number 7 to approve amending the Oregon Highway Plan by adopting the interstate, okay, here we go, Shamala, am I correct? Great. Road interchange area management plan and associated alternative mobility targets and the findings and consistency identified in attachment 3.
Excellent. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Okay, thank you very much. Next, we have a discussion and seeking the approval of the LED pilot project Phase 2 for the design and construction of Region 1 LED lighting replacement project. Great to see you both. Happy to have this before us again.
Good morning, Commissioners. Mac Lynn, Deputy Highway Division Administrator, and with me today is...
Elizabeth Papadopoulos.
I wasn't going to butcher Elizabeth's last name, so thank you.
I've worked with a Dan Despotopoulos, and so
So Elizabeth is our project manager for this effort, and you've heard about this before. In July of 2018, we were in front of the commission to launch into a public-private partnership in this arena. So we're at a critical point now. We've concluded Phase 1, which was really the scoping out of this effort. We're prepared to move into Phase 2, which is really the design and construction and rolling out the replacement of almost 9,500 streetlight fixtures in the Region 1 area. So according to the OIPP rules, you need to execute the decision to approve that contract. So we are looking for a decision and a motion from you today. It's an exciting opportunity, one that I think we are a little late to the game compared to other states in terms of leveraging this opportunity, but it's an exciting one for us in the Portland metro area, and I think we'll learn from this experience as we look to how can we better utilize a tool like this potentially in other parts of the state. So it's pretty straightforward at this point. You heard some feedback previously, some concern about the types of lights, 3,000, 4,000 K, temperature, color, yeah, very complex. We took that feedback to heart and tweaked the approach, as you'll see in the records, to accommodate that request, which on my account, all a good decision. This effort will not only save us some money, it'll save us some costs to the environment in terms of how much electricity we're putting on the system and the demand, but also an ability to go out there and roll out that new technology at a much faster rate than we would be able to do in a piecemeal fashion. So with that, I'd also mention that Amoresco was the firm that we've been working with in Phase 1. We're prepared to move forward with them in Phase 2. 2 of their representatives are here in the room today. All accounts a great partnership with them as they continue to move in this way across multiple states and just talking to them, excited to have this opportunity working with us as their first state agency in Oregon as well. So with that, I defer to any questions that you may have for Elizabeth or myself.
So I just had one, which was a follow-up to your comment about the concerns we heard from others about the type of lighting, the strength of the lighting, and sounds like those concerns have been resolved to mutual satisfaction of the department and the commenters?
Yes. We both addressed color, temperature, and the fact that we're bringing in what are called full cutoff lights. So there'll be less uplighting into the sky, which is a dark sky friendly measure.
So yeah, so Commissioner Van Brockland, I think really listening to what that feedback was and addressing our approach and really learning kind of this space of LED technology, because we've been doing it, one at a time. And so as we look at this kind of massive rollout, how do we address those concerns?
So my comment is, I think this is fantastic. I'm a huge supporter of this. Saves us money. It's, LED lighting is not a new technology, but it's one that I hope this is kind of a piloting project, leads to extensive use of this throughout the state. It seems to me to be, presuming we have the funding, because it's just for all kinds of reasons the right direction to be moving.
Yeah, Commissioner Van Brockland, I think I'd add the funding is a unique aspect, right? It's basically a loan to ourselves because we're going to pay it back over time, reduce costs in the fees for utility services. And if we don't get the return that we thought, that's that contract provision that they're going to help support payments back to us. So kind of a win-win. We're going to address over almost half of the light fixtures in our entire system. So I think as we start rolling the work out next year on the ground, I think we're going to learn pretty quickly, is this a tool we need to actively pursue for the rest of the system? So I personally, I'm looking very forward to see the outcome of this so we can look to how do we leverage that and also leverage what some of the other states are doing as they look to expand this.
Great.
I'm prepared to move it.
Please go right ahead.
Okay. I approve, I move that we approve the LED pilot project phase 2 for the design and construction of the Region 1 LED lighting replacement project.
Any further comment? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. I would just add, thank you for listening and for taking into account the concerns that were raised. I think that often who make those comments don't feel like anything will happen. And in fact, it helped us to really refine the process and the product that we're using. So thank you for that commitment to always really being responsive. It matters.
I think, Chair Boehne, if you will, I'd like to just acknowledge Elizabeth's efforts in this area. This is a new endeavor for us, and she's came on board and has done a fantastic job in building that relationship with Amoresco and helping us prepare to do something we haven't done before. So Elizabeth, thank you. We'll let you go enjoy your camping trip now. So,
All right.
thank you.
Thank you all, and thank Amoresco.
Yes, thank you. Did you have a comment you wanted? I mean, you're welcome to comment if you want, but if you just wanted to.
No, I just want to say thank you very much for the opportunity, and we're excited.
Okay.
And, thank you.
Great, us as well. Okay, next we have a decision around approving the Oregon Department of Transportation Winter Maintenance Strategy Implementation Status Report.
Thank you, Chair Boehne, members of the commission. We are here to talk about, as described, the Winter Maintenance Strategy Implementation Status Report. This is a requirement, Chris Strickler, Highway Division Administrator. This is a requirement of House Bill 2017, where they directed the commission to develop a winter maintenance strategy that includes the use of salt or similar solid product to really look at what our maintenance strategy is as far as keeping roads open, et cetera, through the rough winters. We have a few things that are part of this strategy, and frankly, there has been not a significant amount of change since last year, other than probably one element. As you start to see these pictures kind of coming through, you see that obviously in the state of Oregon, we are intermittently hit with pretty big storms, and then we hit a lull, and then they come back. And we have different mixes of winter, whether that's snowpack or ice, depending upon where you are. And each of those has a different application and those kinds of things as it relates to our strategy going forward. So what we've really put together is a strategy that utilizes salt, not on a pilot basis, which is what we had been on before. And the reason for that, I'll go into briefly and then turn this over to Mac. As you start to look at SALT as a pilot, what it also does in a pilot framework is creates almost a moment where you have incongruity in when you're actually starting to apply and when you would apply and where you would apply. And what I mean by that is in the pilot itself, it did a great job of capturing data and capturing information and looking at the potential deterioration of the facility and all of those factors and environmental factors that come into that pilot. But then transitioning to, okay, it's working great, how fast can we move to something else? That's where it becomes a little bit more difficult. So the real transition that we have in front of you now is kind of that change from the pilot status into a SALT application strategy as part of our winter maintenance strategy that's really more on a route prioritization standing. And that's really what I wanted to introduce as part of this report. That's the foundation of the report we have now.
Yeah, I think, Chris, I'd just add a couple things. So certainly as we launch that pilot, and Paul Mather can speak to the history of this better, but I think you experienced some of that meeting with the crew yesterday in the Ashland maintenance facility and seeing the Siskiyou Pass, where there was one of the first places we really explored the use of it on our system. It's a game changer, but we also want to be careful with it in terms of that environmental monitoring. So still some work. You'll see that in the strategy update around monitoring kind of the impacts, especially up on the Siskiyous, with some efforts with USGS. But also, how are we building out our facilities? There's a great map in there just identifying where do we have those salt storage facilities already today and where we're expanding that. So we're aggressively pursuing that. It's a tool in our toolbox it's highly effective and continue to roll that as a tool. So with that, any questions? We do need approval so we can submit this update to the legislature.
I think it was wonderful to hear the firsthand experience with how this application, this tool is being utilized in Region 3 yesterday with the maintenance crews. That, we can talk about it in terms of policy, and yes, we should use it, but it's until you actually talk to those that are doing it and seeing that benefit, knowing that it has to be the right conditions, applied at the right time, all of those factors. It was good to hear that this is a tool that's being utilized in a meaningful way in certain parts of our state. So it's coupled together in a great package.
And Madam Chair, I might add that that's the exact discussion that really helps us implement on a statewide basis in the appropriate locations, because it allows us to then, and crews to be better trained and better familiar with the application rate and the response time associated with that. And it also helps with crew fatigue because they don't have to be out as frequently with the sand and the plows. So
yes, thank you. So with that, do we have questions or comments? Okay, I would welcome a motion for approving the winter maintenance status report.
Madam Chair, I move for approval of the Oregon Department of Transportation Winter Maintenance Strategy Implementation Status Report.
Excellent. Further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Great job. Next, we have the consent agenda, and we have item 7 that we would be removing because we've already approved that. And Mr. Mather?
Yes, Madam Chair, we've already approved item 7. I have also identified 2 potential conflicts that Vice Chair Van Brockland has, so we would need to take the Sisters of St. Mary of Oregon Ministry Corp. And the Springbrook Estates file separately in the right-of-way resolution portion.
Okay, so, please.
Just to put it on the record, I have a potential conflict of interest in the 2 matters that the Deputy Director just mentioned, and am recusing myself from involvement or voting on those matters.
And just to add detail that Jackie just whispered to me, I need to make sure the file numbers for both of those. The first is, for the St. Mary's, is file number 9514-001, and for the Springbrook Estates, it's 9220-005. So make sure we got those in the record.
Excellent. So let's take those 2 files separately, and I would welcome a motion.
I move for acceptance of the consent calendar as described.
For the files as noted?
For the files as
Okay,
noted.
excellent. Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions?
I abstain.
Okay. And then for the balance of the consent agenda, I would, well, as amended, I would welcome a motion.
So moved.
Okay, further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Okay,
So we have, I have one more business item.
we have a departure.
Oh, yeah. We have we do have a departure at the end of the month. So I'd like to propose the following resolution for consideration by the commission. That is truly something.
Yes. Yeah. It's a tradition at ODOT
It's
that
slightly
I was
creepy,
subject to it, so yeah, I'm just
There you go.
offering.
There you go.
It is nice to see your head on a stick.
Yeah, it is.
Just,
It's
there's something
quite
that's
an experience,
discon-
yes.
Yeah, concerning
We had a
that.
discussion last night, Commissioner Brown and I, about grudges. And the length of grudges, but I won't go into that. So I would like to propose the following resolution for adoption by the commission. Whereas Tammy Baney has served on the Oregon Transportation Commission with distinction for more than 8 years, including serving for more than 4 years as commission chair, and whereas Tammy Baney has a long and distinguished record of service to her community in the state of Oregon, including as a Deschutes County Commissioner and OTC Commissioner and President of the Association of Oregon Counties, and whereas Tammy Baney's service has contributed to a stronger transportation system in Oregon, improved health care for Oregonians, and better housing in the state, and whereas Tammy Baney's leadership has been critical to the development, passage, and successful implementation of House Bill 2017, the most significant investment in Oregon's transportation system in our state's history, and whereas Tammy Baney has significantly contributed to the commission and ODOT building and maintaining successful partnerships with transportation stakeholders throughout the state to ensure that the voices of Oregonians are considered before the commission or ODOT make decisions, and whereas the commission wishes to honor Tammy Baney for her distinguished service to the state and substantial contributions to improving Oregon's transportation system. Now therefore be it resolved that the Oregon Transportation Commission decrees that the conference room in the Region 4 Project Delivery Building shall henceforth be known as the Tammy Baney Conference Room. Now therefore be it further resolved that the Oregon Transportation Commission hereby directs ODOT to officially change the conference room's name and erect appropriate signage to denote its new name.
Thank you.
So I would like a motion on that resolution.
So moved.
Any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Well, I hope the signage does not include said photo on
Well-
stick.
No, and Madam Chair, we have one more tradition that
Oh, my.
yes, yeah, besides the mask, and it explains the handwritten name plaque that you have.
This is precious and
Yeah,
priceless,
you'll be able to
isn't
keep
it?
that, but I have another one for you as well.
Thank you very much.
Well earned.
I think the signage should include the lawnmower.
A little lawnmower, okay.
I was thinking the same thing.
This is the resolution that I should have been brought, and then as in tradition, as we did with all, but you're just extra special. You know, extra special for me, and just in reading the resolution, remembering all the times in House Bill 2017 in particular, not only the other challenges that we talked about last night in the various meetings, but specifically, the commission was challenged in House Bill 2017, and you helped the commission rise to that challenge and made the commission better and stronger, and the relationship with the agency stronger. And I really appreciate your leadership during those times of House Bill 2017 and the lasting effects they're going to have on the commission and on the department. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Your rebuttal time.
My rebuttal, okay, yes.
We're limiting your rebuttal to 45 minutes.
You know, gosh, when I think about when I started on this journey, 8 years, oh my goodness. So, and during that time, raising my daughter, who's now 19, and dragging her to meetings as a single mom, how do you serve and do that? But it feels almost like two different agencies and two different commissions. When we first started, we were just coming out of the recession. Cities and counties, the secure school funding in general was limited. In our own community, we were talking about certain areas, roads going back to gravel, and how do we preserve and maintain this asset that we are charged to take care of. And 2016, we had embarked on the 15 session, which was a bit of what I'd call a little bit of a crash and burn, and then head into 16 and trying to, in a short session, talk about the importance of transportation. Healthcare reform was really the horse to ride. It wasn't around transportation when we have billions of dollars of assets sitting around the state that need to be cared for, and we have a responsibility to do that. The commission, the role clarity between who is the commission and what do we do, is our responsibility, how do we lead the agency, how does the agency lead with a commission? There was a lot of role clarity challenging times, and we were tasked with figuring all of that out. And if I think about where we are today, we are trusted. We are, there's confidence in our abilities as a commission to lead. The agency has credibility and trust with the legislature and communities. I also think about our local government partnerships and the ACT framework, and making sure that over the last 8 years that we've strengthened that. But I think it came full circle for me yesterday hearing Mr. Montero talk about bike ped and trails, which 8 years ago that would not have been the conversation. And when we talked about putting a seat on the ACTS that was for bike ped, the pushback that I personally received as a county commissioner, one of their colleagues, was, well, we represent bike ped. And I thought, but I'm a commissioner as well, and I can't say that. We need to be intentional about the improvements that we're trying to make in community, and it isn't just about pouring asphalt and concrete. It's about linkages and about quality of life and giving options and independence. And so to hear that come full circle and know the challenge that it was to increase the just the broadness of thought of what it means to be transportation is vastly different than just roads and bridges and culverts, and I'm pleased to see that. Jerry's work with the Oregon Health Department Authority and Public Health Department, that is something that will continue, I think, to be a necessary partnership, and I think Oregon is well placed to lead in that space, because as we talk about just again the trails and the health aspects, we are affecting community every time we're in it, and we're a partner in that. So I'm pleased to see that that work is continuing forward as well. And the seismic work that we're doing too. But for me personally, this has just been, oh, I wasn't gonna get emotional. It's been such a journey. I think about what I knew about transportation at that time. And just so you know, when Pat Egan left, he teared up too. So I don't know if you guys recall. So yeah, I'm gonna.
I promise to
Okay.
tear up when it's my turn.
Good. If not, Paul will make you cry. He'll come back. And so there's another story.
That's part of the plan, Paul.
There were a lot of stories told last night. I didn't quite fully comprehend and understand the level of dedication by the ODOT team. I just didn't. And I've been so honored to be a part of this. And, you know, I see Mac back there, all of the CMAC, how we could possibly spend so many hours fighting over 18 million when we just like wave of a wand, spend dollars on other projects. It's so personal on those small dollar spends. But it matters. And so I just would say that I've been honored to be a part of this team. And you've taught me so much, and I've grown so much as a person just working alongside the commissioners themselves. And I'm excited to see the commission where it is today, and I know that you are a great team going forward to be able to lead this extraordinary group of dedicated people. So, and I wanted to say that there's someone who always makes sure that everything runs smoothly. And different for us, this year is that we've had the addition of Michelle and Cooper. But I will tell you that if we talk about a transportation system and what makes it hum in order for us to be able to make good decisions and to be able to set policy, it does not happen without Miss Jackie Carlisle and making sure that everything works. So Jackie, from the bottom of my heart, it's been wonderful to get to know you as a person and serve alongside you. But thank you for always making sure that things are working and we are at our best. And we can't and couldn't have done that without you. So thank you. So with that, off into the sunset, sort of. And of course, because Bob is an attorney, I will be sending him the appropriate billable hours.
Yeah.
For
This gets expensive now.
This gets expensive, Bob. Yeah. No, we have other work that we need to do, and I will be a resource as long as necessary. But I have full faith and confidence in your ability. I do look forward to you presenting and blessing this commission with the gift that I gave you. And so
I'll wear it off.
Yeah. But
in private.
Yeah, in private, exactly. Remember, as you go on this journey, though, one of my favorite all-time quotes, and it has come into play a number of times, and Paul, you noted it, and that is that no one would have ever crossed the ocean if they could have gotten off the ship mid-storm. And we have been in some choppy waters as a commission, as a department. So for me, and you've probably noticed, levity, humor, partnerships, those two things will carry you through any solution-seeking process that you're trying to go through. So do remember that humor is important, making sure that our partnerships are strong, and I think you can get through anything. So with that, thank you. We're adjourned here. Okay. Yes, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any final comments from any of the commissioners or Brenda?
I'd like to make a comment. I was still working when I first started testifying before the OTC, either as of chair of the Southwest Area Commission on Transportation or with Oregon Freight Advisory Committee. And now, having served with you for a year and a half almost, you've been an amazing leader. And I could see it in that early years, even before you were chair. You asked the right questions and you focused on people and the impacts of what we do as a state agency. And I thank you for that.
Thank you.
So she had to go and get emotional. But I just want to thank you. Last night we talked about some of these things, and one of the things that I pointed out to everybody was Tammy always made people in the audience who came before the commission comfortable and always gave them the opportunity to speak their mind and showed it, and you actually showed them respect regardless of how you felt at the moment. And you've set the bar high. And being one of the newest commissioners, I see that I have an opportunity to really grow as a person. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I kind of got to say my piece last night, and we shared our stories. We did. But I'll quickly just point out the theme I was trying to get in, and that is Tammy Bainey's commitment to service to her state and to her community is unparalleled with anyone that I've ever come into contact with in 20 years in the public sector around Oregon. So I know that this isn't the last we're going to see of Tammy Bainey, and I know that that commitment to service to your community and to your state and to your region will continue. And so we look forward to supporting those efforts. I know the governor looks forward to supporting those efforts because you're the emblematic public servant, and it's been an honor to work with you.
Thank you. It's been an honor to work with you too.
Maybe I can just conclude today by saying that I've known a number of members of the Transportation Commission, several chairs over the years, including two of my former law partners. The commission has always been blessed with great talent. So I am presumptuously speaking for all of the commissioners now who served with you, because I think this is one of the interesting things about the commission. It's an ongoing entity. It precedes and succeeds any of us who are privileged to serve on it, but specifically those who you served with from the date you came on until August 31st of this year when you go off. So I'm just going to presumptuously speak for all of them without their consent. I am quite confident that everything you heard last night, and almost everything you heard last night, and everything you've heard today would be reflected in their comments were any or all of them here. So we really are representative of a lot of people who you've worked with on the commission, in the agency, in the state, and beyond the lines of the state to serve Oregon well. You don't replace a Tammy Bainey. That's not what happens, just as you don't replace others who preceded you. We all bring unique skills, and you have yours. I would say that the comments about your level of dedication and just tireless commitment to service is really extraordinary. And the other thing that I would say, kind of drafting on something Julie just said, is you have remarkable artistry in the way you interact as a leader with people, and that's a gift. So we are, the point I'm trying to make here is that we stand on the shoulders of those that precede us, and we all stand on your shoulders today, which in my case will be painful because I'm a lot bigger than you. But you really are a person that has laid a set of foundations that were built off of those who preceded you, and what we hope to do going forward, and what I hope to do as chairman of the commission going forward, is build on that record and that foundation, and to make a difference in the ways that we're able to make a difference. So I want to congratulate you for your service, and you're a young person, so there's a lot ahead for you, and and I look forward to following that, and I look forward to continuing to interact with you going forward, and it's been really a privilege to work with you.
Thank you.
So we're adjourned.